So, Dave, how did you first come across magic? Or I suppose the better question is, when did you first have an inkling that what you were being told at school probably wasn't all that there was?
One of my earliest childhood memories is my dad telling me that magic wasn't real. At the,
Okay.
I think I was coming up to my fourth birthday, and I'd asked for a magic wand, just like Sooty's got,
Right, right.
the one that can do magic. And my dad sort of obviously honourably felt he had to disappoint me that he couldn't provide me with something that would make, my will manifest. So I got interested in science from there, and it was really, I think I really sort of started to emerge from that in my late teens when I took a lot of LSD.
Sure, right. Yeah.
This is late 60s, early 70s, and it was very strong in those days, and it had, very interesting effects on me. I got very into it for a couple of years, basically, and I
And were
recognized.
you seeing it as like a party drug, or had you some sort of like insight? Like, was it a spiritual kind of thing at that point, or just a bit of fun? Or
It was kind of like I had a sort of confused ragbag of desires for what I wanted out of it. I'd sort of heard the psychedelic rock music and thought, wow, that sounds like an amazing state of consciousness.
right,
But obviously, I wanted to do it just for the fun. But when I actually took some the first time, it turned out to be quite a low dose, and I I was aware of myself as a web of energy. I was immediately aware of myself as, like, rather than just being a self in a body, I was instead a sort of kind of, sensitive, leaky energy system.
all right, okay, right,
So that was kind of the first time I'd ever really thought that. I'd fallen for the silly old Cartesian dualism before that.
right, right, okay.
Oh, it's not right. It's bollocks. It's my when I close my eyes, it's not like I have a body. It's like I am a set of sensations, or I feel a set of sensations, and none of those directly maps onto the seeing a body from the outside. So it was like a sort of a new dimension to my internal world.
And up to that point, had you had any sort of like, was your family religious at any way, or were there, like, I know your dad said that magic didn't exist, but you can have people who don't believe magic exists but still go to church on Sunday. Like, what was the, I suppose, what was the family background or the society background at that, before your LSD?
Yeah, no, not really. No, my family were kind of like nominally Church of England, which meant, kind of non-religious, really.
Yeah.
So it was that was about it. Although actually, because my mate was going to Sunday school, I asked if I could go to Sunday school when I was about kind of like 10 or something,
Right.
maybe, and went along and really enjoyed the stories kind of thing and talking about the stories in the Bible, and quite enjoyed that. And I've always enjoyed singing. So, occasionally enjoyed going to church just to sing the hymns.
Right. Right. But
But
so
yeah,
there was no kind of belief, I suppose, at that, but there was no anti-belief. Like, you weren't an atheist, or you weren't kind of
no, there
just
was no
didn't
kind of
care right away.
no kind of pressure from my family, and nothing I had to resist really there.
Right.
It was all a bit loose.
So after your LSD experiences, did that kind of awaken a want in you to, search for some answers, or was it, or what was the kind of effect?
Well, yes. I mean, I had what I would now. I mean, I had all sorts of interesting experiences. Like I had energy sort of that flowed out of me and affected other beings. I wrote a bit about this in Life Force, and other times I
Hmm.
accidentally zapped a cat just
Oh
by
wow!
very throwing some energy across the room. The cat was fine afterwards, but it's just that it jumped in the air, and it was like, it just so, oh wow, and this energy stuff is real.
And were you trying to do something, or was it just you happened to
I
move
just
your
noticed.
hand in the correct direction?
And I just sort of went like that, and this bolt of energy shot across the room and hit the cat, which was sleeping,
Right.
jumped in the air, and got out of the room. And I thought, oh God, I went and looked to see what was happening with the cat, and it was fine. It had just like jumped out into the yard and was all right down. That was my friend's place, and so I knew that energy was real. Then I had what was a very strange kind of moment where it seems as if I was contacting some spirit. That didn't last very long, but I began, my normal sort of reality began to fray at the edges. But those were in a way the minor things. There was something much bigger going on that I would now say that I actually was given an opportunity to listen to the deepest part of me, what I've come to know as the silent knowing, a kind of spiritual intuition. And but I had various instances of that and came to know it during those couple of years. But then one day I had an experience which was quite unpleasant. It was sort of a pretty sort of dark set of situations arose in my mind, and this trip with a few other people. And I literally walked away from it. I walked for miles until I'd calmed down a bit. And then I sort of looked at what had happened, and I realized, looking back on it, some while later, I realized that I'd made a decision to leave aside all that stuff. So I did, I did take acid again a few times after that, but it was on the downslope after that. And it was just...
I assume that wasn't like your first bad trip, or like, I'm sure you
No,
like,
no, I did have, I actually had a couple of bad trips, and it was like I'm glad that I had a sort of naive intensity about it all at that stage, because I went down to Hyde Park for a free festival where the Pink Floyd were premiering the Atom Heart Mother.
Oh wow! Cool.
In 1970, I think it was, in about August or something like that. And I was down there with a friend of mine who'd been installed some acid, so we took one, and everything got a bit strange at first, and then I thought, oh dear, this is going somewhere different and not very pleasant. So for some reason, I thought the obvious response to that was to take another 2.
But of course, it's logically speaking, it's the perfect thing to do.
Just, and this is kind of following a bad one I'd had a few weeks before, and I'm glad I did that, because it sort of just burned through it. Basically, I just got to the state where I felt really helpless, and I just, and then this voice came into my head, and it just said, "You cannot allow this to continue." All right then, and stop all the bad stuff happening. And I just exploding with golden light, and heart chakra opening, and all of that sort of good stuff. And it was a wonderful day. So I kind of burnt through the worst of my bad trip stuff on that session, and never really got afflicted in that way again. But it was still a case. It was the next year that I had this experience, which went beyond that and went into a darkness I couldn't handle. Right. So
it is interesting that you physically walked away. Like, I mean, like any amount of symbolism in that. Like,
we were all out in the countryside. There was myself and my girlfriend at the time, but our relationship was a bit dodgy. It was breaking them up at the edge, which I think is the emotional tone, the background emotional tone, that made things so difficult. And a bunch of people, only one of whom I really knew, some student people from the university. And my girlfriend was at the university, I wasn't. And we were all out there, and I just felt completely alienated from everything that was going on. And I realized that I was not going to be, that my thing with my girlfriend was not going to continue much longer. And I just everything started getting really unpleasant and horrible. And I thought, okay, I just need to move. I just need to keep moving. So I walked back probably about 5 or 6 miles into Sheffield, and I calmed down a lot by the time I found somewhere to go and have a quiet beer and think about it all.
Yeah. And did that then? I know you said you took it a couple of times after that, but that was that the peak kind of moment where you go, right, that whatever I had to learn from this experience is now complete, or what was your kind of conclusion out of that?
It was more of a realizing that I reached, it was what I remember, kind of like getting a bottle of beer and going and sitting in a back room in this bar. And I was on my own for a while, and I just thinking about what had just happened. And it was all as if this voice was in my head, and it was kind of telling me things, but in a really strange way. There was this sort of like globs of meaning that later I sort of translated, and there was 3 overlapping bits of meaning. And one of them was that I've made a decision, although at first I thought it was a decision I had to make. Later I realized I'd already made it. And then there was something that was going to happen when I was about 64 or 65. And then this idea of death. And even then I recognized that death could symbolize extreme change. Didn't necessarily mean you physically die. So I thought, oh, wow, I was 19 at the time. So I thought, oh, this stuff's going to happen like 46 years in the future, so it's no concern of mine at all.
Yeah,
When
yeah.
you're that age, you either think you're going to live forever or you're going to die next year, and it doesn't matter, you
That's
know.
it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We're all gonna
So
die at 27 anyway. So,
yeah, yeah. So it was like I just realised that a whole part of my life, eventually looking back on that some while later, I realised that a whole part of my life had kind of come to an end for the time being. It was frozen, and then as it happened, funnily enough, when I was about 64, when I was actually in my 65th year, before my 65th birthday, I I did have one of the profoundest spiritual experiences of my last few years, and that's a
yeah.
result of meditating daily for a
Were
few
you
years.
kind of expecting it, or had you forgot about the kind of the premonition, or?
I kind of was. I mean, a few years before that, I'd sort of dug back into my memories and kind of like trying to line the whole thing up and see what was happening. And I thought, well, something of spiritual significance, assuming I'm not actually going to die. I don't think it would have bothered whatever it was that was talking through me, which
Mm.
I suppose now I'd think of as my holy guardian angel. Whatever it was that was talking through me didn't, wouldn't have bothered telling me I was going to die. That's a useless piece of information. So
Sure.
I,
Yeah.
it was more to do with I was going to be completely transformed. So I was thinking for years before I was expecting some sort of profound spiritual experience. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because I suppose that can, in many ways, you're told that can hinder, the expectation or the longing or whatever can kind of hinder it. So it's interesting that you're still aware of it, but it still happened. I suppose that's the nature of prophecy too, isn't it?
Yes. Yes.
So right, you're early 20s at this point. You've closed the chapter on your life in some ways, whatever. So what happened next? Where did you go?
Well, next I went back to the my other main thing that all through my childhood had been science. I was a
Mm.
science kid for various reasons. I think science was kind of like a substitute for magic from the age of 4 onwards. I got interested in science, recognizing at some gut level, I suppose, the Faustian bargain, and this is the
Sure.
modern form of it.
Mm.
And I found science really, really easy to get top marks in at school. So it
All
was
right.
like lazy. That was it. I just was the science kid from then on, and I was no good at anything else. So I just did science. And so, yeah, I went and did a science degree. And I went late. I went to do that late. I didn't go into my degree course straight from school. I did do another course, but I didn't find that very interesting. And then I sort of like dropped out, and that was still my acid years. And then at about the age of 21, I actually did go to college and take it seriously and got a degree in molecular biology.
Oh wow,
And
cool.
that was, I think I got my degree in 1975. And by the end of that, I was already sort of starting to think, well, science has really got its limits, hasn't it? I knew this when I was in my acid years, but I started looking at it philosophically, reading a bit of philosophy and realizing that what I thought of as science was a sort of secure intellectual place to be. It was okay. It was kind of like come down from all that stuff and just get sensible. Okay. Also, over that era, I got together with someone and we'd had a child. So at the age of 21, I was a father. So I realised I
Oh,
had to take life a lot more seriously.
sure. Yeah, yeah. And was that
So,
part of the reason why you went to college to get your degree as well?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, thought, yeah, come on, I need a career. I need something I can do that will help support my family. So I went along with that. But by the end, like I say, by the end of the course, I'd started to realise that science kind of like was suspended over an abyss of doubt and incoherence, and it wasn't as secure as I'd thought. And I
Were you
went.
expecting in some ways that you'd be convinced of materialism or whatever by doing the science
Yeah,
that? Yeah, yeah.
I think there was that element of it, sort of like it would, kind of like save me from this morass of weird spiritual longings,
Right.
which I couldn't make any sense of. Um, but instead, I discovered that that science didn't provide that kind of coherence at all. But I continued with the science career. In 1996, 76. I went up to Leeds to do some postgrad work at the university there, and during that time, during that first year there, I took up meditation. I just did the transcendental meditation thing, where you go
Okay.
along, take a flower and some money, and they give
Yes,
you
and somebody.
I'm offering, and and they give you a mantra, and I did that every day and quite enjoyed that. And I thought, oh, I want to go a bit further than this. And one lunchtime in Leeds Student Union, while I was having my, pie and peas lunch or something, I picked up this leaflet about an occult group.
Oh.
And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. So I went along to a meeting, and it was a bunch of people who, it wasn't the Leeds University Union Occult Society, but that evolved out of this because me and this other guy decided to found a proper university society, because then we'd get money and we'd be able to use rooms in the university union and stuff. So we formed the LUUOS, which existed way into the 1980s and possibly beyond, and then mutated into something else, became unrecognizable. But yeah, we were the founder members of that. And the first group, though, the occult group, a couple of people who set that up were fans of somebody who called himself Amado Crowley.
Oh, right. Yeah. The alleged son of Mr. Crowley.
Yeah, the so-called son. Yeah. And he actually kind of visited Leeds a couple of times over the next year or so. And increasingly, I realized that wasn't my path. But by then, I'd got really interested in magic and had started reading Crowley, started reading a little bit of Golden Dawn, the post-Golden Dawn stuff, and Dion Fortune, all that kind of stuff that was available. Mostly kind of westernized esoteric Kabbalah, essentially.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. So, yeah.
And is that what the kind of trust, or was that the kind of theme of the Occult Society? Was that kind of Kabbalah-led Golden Dawn?
Well, we were.
Or was it more exploring? Like, was there elements of Buddhism we used, or whatever? Like, was it more open, or like what to give talk about? I suppose.
Yeah. A good question. I'm searching my memory now to remember some of the earliest talks. But I mean, I suppose we're talking about, like I'm saying, about 1977. And by 1978, I'd actually come across, because the Sorcerer's Apprentice is in Leeds, and that's one of the UK's probably oldest and perhaps best in some ways occult supply service. And at the time, it was a shop. I think it's all online now, I'd imagine. I haven't looked at it for years. A strange, dingy, dark little shop that smelled wonderful when you walked in. And Chris Bray, who ran it, was quite into giving people a bit of, pointing people in different directions. So buy books from there, chat with him. And I learned, I first came across Chaos Magic there in 1978, Lieber Null, first edition.
Right. Yeah. That was published out of that shop, wasn't it, originally?
Yeah, it was published in 1978. And I think, yes, Chris Bray certainly had something to do with it, although the first main edition was Ray Sherwin's, what was he called? Morton Press is what he called his imprint. And so we started, that was perfect for me. So we'd been kind of like just having little discussions which didn't really go on. And all of a sudden there was an overall frame to look at magic through. And that really suited me. And I thought, oh, this is magic for people with a science background, recovering scientism.
Yeah.
And so that was perfect for me. That early sort of Carolian semi-scientism really matched my mood at the time and helped me step into magic full time as a belief. So I started experimenting with sigils and so forth, and other people in our little group did. And we started inviting people. We had a few people from different traditions. We had Patricia Crover, the witch, the high priestess witch. She came along and did a really good talk. We had, of course, Ray Sherwin, because he was local. The Sorcerer's Apprentice every Saturday used to open its old shop, which was an even dingier little shop next door, which didn't use much, but they used to open it for a coffee morning on Saturday, and you could have this sort of pay a few pennies and have some instant coffee. Nice. And there's a kettle in there, and there's little sachets of instant coffee. So you could sort of like sit around, and it was amazing, because at the time, Ray Sherwin, of course, was living just out in a village just outside Bradford, which is only 9 miles. So they're almost like a conurbation together. And so Pete Carroll had just come back from his travels, and so he'd been to the Far East and Australia and stuff. So they used to turn up for these coffee mornings sometimes. So I got to meet them, and I got to meet other people as well, like who's not as famous, like Richard Bartle Batelli is an artist.
Okay.
Designed I think he was most notorious for was probably the sexual tarot.
Right.
like something out of Illuminatus.
Yeah.
And yeah, various other people, and some various people
And what
who.
was your kind of I don't mean, I suppose, opinion of these people. What was your kind of general feel like? Would you go, oh, these people, they have the secret, or did they feel more contemporary as seekers, or what was like? Was there a hierarchy, or what was the?
There was. It was a sort of. It was only a short hierarchy. There wasn't. I didn't imagine great levels behind it, but I did think of Ray Sherwin and Pete Carroll as being people who were more experienced than me and who I could learn from.
Right.
And in 1980, there was enough people who were interested to form a Chaos Magic group, which was basically the first IoT group in Britain,
Okay.
that was based in Ray Sherwin's village, East Morton. So I was, I jumped at the opportunity to join that, and quite rapidly after that, I realised that there was only a kind of a shallow hierarchy here. It wasn't that these people weren't that much more advanced than me. They might have done a bit more practice in some areas, but the whole thing of Chaos Magic at that stage, one of its really good features was this kind of punk DIY attitude, where go in and just slap something together and try it and see what happens. And of course, you get results. Of course, you do. So it's like, wow, I can get results with such a simplistic technology. So yeah, so there wasn't the hierarchy didn't really last very long.
Right. And what was the kind of the general feel of Chaos Magic at the time? Because I know it's like now it's everywhere and everyone's quite accepting of it. But I suspect that when it came out first, it was kind of frowned upon, probably maybe from the more traditional people, or well, still kind of frowned upon, I suppose, by the more traditional people.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, I mean, there was some people who came along to the coffee mornings used to mock it. By the way, just as a quick aside, one thing that those coffee mornings taught me was that never underestimate the power of a soiree.
Right.
Well, right, a couple of two or three of people who've got something, and then other people just coming along, because that really was the nucleus of Chaos Magic in this country. I think it was probably the main nucleus of Chaos Magic in this country at that time.
Right.
And so, but some of the people that came along to those coffee mornings did mock the whole chaos thing. It was just like just sloppy work. There was some kind of strict Kabbalists from Batley who used to come on, and from up in the hills, and they would mock the whole thing. But I sided with the Chaos Kids. I think the attitude for me was it was really exciting. I remember seeing a book by Robert Anton Wilson. I think it was Illuminati Papers Volume 2 or something. It was Cosmic Trigger Volume 2, one of those ones he brought out in probably about 1980, 81. And it's got this picture of somebody sitting there. I'm not sure whether it's two people or one people. You can find this cartoon. I'm sure it still exists online. It's a cartoon. And the heading is, "Hey, man, are you only using half your brain?"
Right.
Like stone furry hippie in one side, and there's kind of an intellectual in the other. And the point being, that Wilson's multi-model agnosticism would give you a richer experience of life, because otherwise you'd be prejudiced and stuck in one view of reality, which of course is what Illuminatus was all about. It wasn't as explicit. Sure. Illuminatus is probably the first book I read that convinced me that I could believe in magic as a real thing. I read it in about 7, at the beginning of that phase. But yeah, there was just that's how it seemed to me. It seemed like I'd, as this science kid who'd gone into acid, it seemed to me that this was the way forward. It was like, wow, you can take all the sort of critical perspectives of science and the vast, molten, mystical and magical perspectives of magic and work them together. And that's what it was for me. Of course, after a while, I realized that it wasn't like that for everybody. And in fact, Pete Carroll was quite scientistic. His approach to magic was quite scientistic. But by then, I wasn't bothered, and I was developing my own take on it anyway. So I mixed in as much mysticism as I wanted. But yeah, it was exciting. It was like a completely new thing.
And what sort of magic, like, what were you doing magic for? Or what was, I suppose, the big question is, what was the moment, or what was the magic, the sigil, the ritual that absolutely convinced you that, all right, I'm on to something? Or was it a more kind of amalgamation of a number of different workings? Or
Oh, it was a bit of both. There were some moments where I just blew my reality apart completely, but there was it was a drip feed mostly of minor successes, like for instance losing touch with an old friend, and I did a sigil to get her to get back in touch with me because I thought, well, who knows, maybe she's got information about where I am, and like a few days later, bang, she got back in touch.
Right. Yeah.
And things like that. That was one I happen to remember. There's all sorts of other minor ones, but there was a really weird one, which I mean, I'm still struggling to interpret and integrate into my worldview. And that's when I saw somebody levitate.
Oh, wow.
Right back in the early days as well. And that was just 4 of us were doing this, Kabbalistic path working together. We were completely sober. I mean, literally, I got into a phase of not even smoking dope much at that time, and none of us had had anything to drink. I mean, the strongest thing we'd had was a cup of tea, literally.
That's dangerous stuff. Cups of tea.
It must have been, yeah. Around at my girlfriend's place, and there's this other couple, and 4 of us were doing this meditation together, and we're all sitting around afterwards, and we're all quite tired, and we're just sitting there. And she, my girlfriend, she's laid on the floor in front of the fire, and she raises her hand to her brow, and suddenly she's tilted at about 30-40 degrees to the horizontal, her feet in the air and the back of her head resting on the ground.
Wow.
And I look at the other 2 people, I'm going sort of, and they're going, yes. We're all just completely blown away, and we just waited a few more seconds, and she sort of like all of a sudden she was back down again, but not with a slam, but just as if there was an instantaneous translation.
Right.
So I said to her, did you just
levitate?
Did you just rise into the air? What did you experience there, or words to that effect? And she said, yeah, I tried not to be a leading question. That's right. I said, what did you experience just then? And she said, I just rose into the air.
Wow.
So that, like I say, I'm still struggling to interpret that. There isn't any respectable way to interpret an event like that.
No.
It's just completely, it's one of those Fortean, world of the damned things. It's just one of those damned bits of evidence that you cannot find a respectable place for.
And I suppose one of those things that, if depending on who you're saying it to, people either believe you or don't believe you, and there's no convincing, like there's no, because without an explanation, you can't convince anyone.
Yeah. I mean, I've written about this a bit. I mean, she did have strange things happen around her, although that was the strangest. She was she was a bit like one of these people that carry poltergeists around with them, weird energy stuff happened.
Yeah.
And I come across one other person many years later, and we actually nicknamed him Pete the Poltergeist, because everywhere he went, this sort of stuff happened,
Yeah. So what sort of authors and what sort of books were you involved with this time? Like, it was obviously a bit of Robert Anton Wilson. Was there anyone else?
Yeah, I was sort of working my way through Crowley, and finding most of it too sort of overblown for my taste at that stage. I was into the stripped down punky minimalism of chaos discourse, really. So I liked Crowley. I saw a lot of value in his writings, and I saw him as a direct predecessor of chaos magic, which he was in a way.
Yeah.
Which of course Pete Carroll did originally admit that, then later on went off him and started to say that chaos magic grew out of other things. But there was a bit of that, and I was still recognizing that there was something missing in my own magical world, that the amazing experiences I had on acid were just not entirely being represented. I wasn't entirely working towards that, which is part of there's been this kind of like, I wonder if I can kind of like, having had a helicopter flight over the sacred mountain, am I going the right way on foot now?
Right.
To reach
Yes.
that was kind of like part of my inner model, and I wasn't sure I was, and I started reading a bit into the more mystical side of things, like Dion Fortune and so forth, looking back at that stuff. And I actually collided with a bunch of other people, a group from Southampton, actually. I was living in Leeds, but they were working this kind of post-Dion Fortune sort of scrying and spiritual kind of aspiration sort of magic. So I joined with them as well. So I was kind of straddling two worlds at that point. I was doing all this, kind of like Baphomet stuff and stuff with sigils on them in Leeds, and then going out to Southampton and doing visionary stuff involving the Tattvas and the I Ching and
Right. Wow. Yeah.
inner planes of depths and things like that. So I was trying to straddle both worlds.
And had you an overall goal that you were trying to attempt, or was it just kind of you see what was happening? Like, was there a kind of any sort of sense of aiming for, like, say, an awakening or HGA contact, or what was the overall drive? If
I
any?
went in, yeah, the overall, it gradually, it took years for me to articulate what I was doing, really, because I kept alternating between belief and disbelief in awakening and in the idea of the holy guardian angel and things like that. Sometimes I had experiences which seemed to indicate that all that stuff was real, and then something in me would just slam shut and say, no, come on, it's just, people sitting around for years and they eventually achieve some exotic state and they just say that it's better than the state everybody else has got, So
Yeah.
I was occasionally cynical about the whole thing. So it took a long time. It's only really much more recently that I've started to understand how it all fits. Well, not all of it, but how my quest fits together.
Right. And at this, when did you start doing your writing, and when did you start emerging as your kind of your own Dave Lee-ness into the world? Was that around this time, or?
A bit, but I never published anything I did there. Well, actually I did. There were a few things that I wrote in the early '80s because Chris Bray at the Sorcerer's Apprentice, he started a magazine. Well, he'd taken the name of a defunct magazine from Leeds, The Lamp of Thoth, which
All
of course what the gutter press called it the Lump of Filth. So that stuck. But I wrote a couple of little meditations for that based on my own pathworking experiences and so forth, like kind of tarot card type meditations. And then I got a bit more adventurous, and the group in Southampton, we started looking at gematrias that might interpret the Book of the Law and things like that, and so I published a piece on that, which I recently rediscovered in my notes and dug out and reread. So yes, the Lamp of Thoth, the Lump of Filth was good for me in the early days. It was an opportunity for me to be stimulated to write things. But I mean, I didn't really write much until Chaos International came along in the mid to late '80s.
I think you're right. You wrote a good bit for that. Was that like an ongoing kind of?
Well, it emerged from the scene I was in, from the magical group I was in with Ray Sherwin and a few other people in the, let me think, when did that group start? That would have started in about 84, I guess. And by about 86, we were, talking about putting a magazine together. I suggested the name Chaos International, actually, as a result of my girlfriend. She occasionally used to read sort of upscale fashion mags just for the hell of it. And she had a copy of Harper's and Queen International lying about. So I just thought, let's go for really sort of snobby classy here as an ironical thing. So I said Chaos International, and it stuck. So that's how it got its name. And the first issue was, nominally anyway, edited by Ray Sherwin. I think the second was as well. And then I took it. The idea was the editorship would rotate, and I took on the third and fourth, and then passed it on to Phil Hine, and then it got passed on to Ian Reid. Nobody else really wanted it after that, so it got, Ian got stuck with it and made a really good job of doing a whole series up to issue 23.
Right. Oh, I didn't notice that quite that many. That's cool.
Yeah, there were 23. And then there was a couple more after that.
Of course, there was 23. Of course, there was 23.
But yes, I started doing a lot more. The longest thing I'd ever written was for the first issue of Chaos International, was Magical Ionics. It was just my ramble about how magic fitted into the spirit of the times, as it were.
All right. And what were you doing at this time? I suppose professionally, and what was your real life, or what was it? Were you still doing the science thing, or had you dropped that altogether? Or?
Well, yeah, I my post-grad work came to an end without a higher degree. I made various not so good decisions during those years, and ended up on a research project that really went nowhere. So that came to an end in 1980, and I was unemployed for a bit and trying to find my feet, but really kind of full time into magic and not being that bothered about work for a while. And then, yeah, gradually started building up other interests, started making incense, started my own, own little sort of attempts to sell incense and other magical things that I'd made. And let me think, I'm trying to think of what the next time I actually had anything approaching a respectable job. Yeah, a lot of the 1980s, I was in and out of trying out various jobs and things and not settling into anything. And then in the late 80s, I got an opportunity with a couple of friends, to buy out Ray Sherwin's shop, Id Aromatics.
All right.
And he wanted to move on and do something else. So we bought him out and ran that shop and wholesale and mail order business I was involved in it for 9 years. We turned it into a limited company, and I sold my shares in that in 98 and went off and did other things. But yeah, that was the core of my work, was the world of aromatics, actually, for a few years.
Right, so you were completely at that point embedded in magic as both private and professional. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Was there a sense at some point that it was more than just a couple of people hanging out on a Saturday morning drinking tea, that it was becoming the chaos magic kind of thing was getting a bit more international, I suppose, to use the thing? Was there a feeling that you were, part of a bigger movement than a local movement?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, the IoT was founded nominally in 1978, and I think it was just really Pete Carroll and Ray Sherwin and a couple of other people. And then there was our group, and then there was, I think there was another group in London quite early on, which would have coalesced around Ian Reid and Ingrid Fisher. And then, but it was all very, very small until 1986 or 87, when Pete Carroll announced the formation of the Pact of the Illuminates of Thanaterra. So it was a new stage of the IoT.
Okay.
And it was because he'd got a new working partner who was much better. I mean, I'm no good at self-promotion and all that stuff. Neither was Pete Carroll, but he started working with Ralph Tegmeier in the German-speaking world, who's someone who's very, very good at publicity and promotion.
Right.
And so they basically relaunched the IoT, and within a few years, it was many, many times the size. It went from being probably a dozen people to being many times that in just a couple of years. And that was really 1987 onwards is when it really blew open. I think we did something in Leeds. We did the Chaos Symposium, the name obviously inspired by the Thelemic Symposium that used to happen every year in Oxford. Morgan used to run. Oh, let's have a Chaos one in Leeds. And we only ever did one, but it was great. Loads of people turned up. We had some good speakers. I did my first kind of major public speaking event, and Pete Carroll was there, and Ralph Tegmeier was there, a couple of other people speaking, and yeah, it was a terrific success. And the after party at Ray Sherwin's was an amazing networking experience, just like people from from all over the British occult scene, plus people from the German speaking world, Germany, Switzerland, Austria.
Wow, yeah.
So it was just, it really, I think that was the year it really blew open, 1987.
I suppose then at some stage going into the 90s, maybe the bubble burst. There seems to be a kind of a point where arguments start to happen, and obviously not asking you to air out any dirty laundry or anything like that, but was there a peak time, you would say, before it kind of...
That was basically 1990 to 91. There was a big split in the IoT, which Pete Carroll referred to as the Ice War. And he's published various online things about this.
This is with Frater UD, is that am I correct?
Yeah, that was Ralph Tegmeier's Frater UV. So that was, you can read his side of the argument online. I think Tegmeier's published a lot less about it, or maybe almost nothing. So it tends to be, the narrative tends to have been, all derived from Pete Carroll. But yeah, so that was a big split in the IoT. Pete Carroll left as leader in 1991, and in a way, he sort of walked out rather abruptly, leaving it in other people's hands. But that ended up being a really good thing.
Okay.
Because you've probably heard of founder syndrome in
Yeah.
various organizations, where the person who founds an organization is no longer, because other people are involved, the values of the organization grow beyond that person's values. And so what happened as Pete walked away, there was this tremendous kind of like surge in different directions. And his attempts to sort of come back since in various ways weren't very successful, because it had already, his child had grown away from him. And so there was a continued expansion in the 90s, but of a different sort. And I think that's when Chaos Magic really started to come of age.
Yeah, I think most people that I would know now who've got into Chaos Magic got into it more in the 90s, and probably Grant Morrison being, the reason for an awful lot of it, was when you started seeing things like Grant Morrison talking about hyper sigils, and Alan Moore had obviously been talking about magic, not too much at that stage, but later on. Were you a comic fan? Were you aware of that stuff going on, or what do you think about that?
Only later, really. I mean, I've always liked Alan Moore's stuff, and I read from the 80s onwards. I quite often read 2000 AD comic, and so I was aware of, Grant Morrison was doing things even back then in 2000 AD, wasn't he? I don't know whether.
Yeah, he was doing Zenith, was that his big one?
Zenith, yeah. Alan Moore was doing, that one about the young lass who stows away on a starship.
Halo Jones.
Yes, yeah. So I was enjoying those serials at that stage, but I didn't realize, and of course there was obvious magical content in some of that stuff, particularly more explicitly in Grant Morrison's stuff. But it was a few more years, really. It was more like the late 90s that I started to realize how, that these people were actually practicing magicians. And which is, a delight to learn that there's people out there who are putting this stuff out into the world. Isn't it funny how some of the most advanced writing has come up through the comics world?
Sure, yeah, it seems
incredible how that's happened, isn't it? I mean, Pat Mills is another one. I follow him on; he's still around, and all of that stuff. Slain, and all of those stories, very magical. And
there seems to be some sort of connection between, I suppose, magic and art and comics and writing. That it's like, I'm sure that there's plenty of magic books, if you want, stories about magic or books about magic, but it doesn't seem to have the level that comics has incorporated magic.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's just it really is. It's just really raw and vivid, and a sense that these people know even though this is fantasy writing, that these people nonetheless know something about the underlying ideas of magic, and that comes over in their work. And that guy who did Luther Arkwright, what's he called?
I have it here. I do know there wasn't his name. What is his name?
I love his stuff as well. I mean, I was into his stuff way back in 1980. And that was more sci-fi.
Brian Talbot. Thank God. Yeah. Well done, Brian.
All of those people were into an area of sort of sci-fi fantasy that was beginning to move into magic at the very least, and if not actually explicitly magical.
And so, did any of them turn up at any point in any of the meetings or any of the gatherings, or was there any communication? Like, did Alan Moore turn up at any point, or?
No. I met Alan Moore briefly in 1997 at an event that Mog Morgan put on in London called Ananke, and I did a talk there about bringing together the currents of magic and psychedelics. Which has always been an interest of mine, of course, and I wrote a little. So I did a little talk about that, and Alan Moore was there and doing one of his. Looking at the layers of time in one area, and because we were in Conway Hall in London, he did Holborn, that area of London, and I love those performances of his, and that was really great. And I got to sort of meet him and briefly shake his hand afterwards, but he didn't seem very communicative, because it's like you just done a big performance, and you're not naturally that outgoing a person, perhaps. No. I see that you probably wouldn't want to shake everybody's hands and have a lengthy conversation with him, so it's okay. We just went our way. So that's the only time I ever met him. But about the same year was when I brought out my Chaotopia, the first edition of it, and that was the first lengthy book I'd written. I mean,
Right.
I'd written a book on incense making in 1991, and then I'd written some other stuff. I'd written a book on wealth magic, which is still out there, in '93, I think. And but I hadn't written a full-length book about magic in general, and that was my first one. And I did self-publish that. And when it was all ready to go, and I made some flyers up on a computer, made some little flyers up on what used to be called DTP in those days, and to leave around and go. And I thought, Grant Morrison, he's obviously into magic, so I'll send one to him via his publisher in New York. So I sent it to Vertigo Press in New York, this little flyer about my book and a little cover note saying, "Dear Mr. Morrison, I imagine you're into chaos magic. Perhaps you'd be interested in my new book," kind of thing.
Yeah.
About just over a week later, I was taking a break from work. At that time, I was living in Nottingham because I was trying to open another branch of the aromatics business, which didn't do terribly well, so we pulled it back. But I was living in Nottingham and working really long hours on that. And one day I sort of nipped home for a bit of lunch and just to sit for half an hour, and the phone rang, an actual landline phone. So this is like the days of mobile. So this is like really improbable. And I pick it up, and it's Grant Morrison calling.
No way! Oh wow!
Book, and we had quite a lengthy chat about magic, and then about 2 years later, I was going out with this lass who was a violinist, and she did a performance as part of a thing where Grant Morrison was giving a talk and things. So I got to meet him in the flesh there.
Right.
So really nice bloke, yeah, really very pleasant chap.
That's quite cool that you rang you up, and it's so weird, like when you think of like even talking about the old phones, and like if a phone rang now, you've gone, something's obviously wrong,
Exactly.
Yeah. So who else was coming on the scene around that time? I suppose Randy Dukes would have been about at that point too. Did you interact with him? Was he on the scene in the same way, or?
Yeah, a bit. I read his book SSOTBME in about 1979 and thought, he's definitely in on this current. Of course, I didn't really understand the full, historical nature of it then. Of course, it was really him. Robert Anton Wilson is, in a way, the spiritual ancestor of chaos magic, because he came up with the idea of multi-model agnosticism.
Sure.
That unless you have a whole bunch of belief systems about how the world works, you're throttling your life down to unnecessarily. And yet there's something scary about having all those different belief systems and moving between them. So he kind of established that. And then Lionel at about the same time. I mean, we're talking 1974, I think that book came out.
Oh, is it that early? Is it really?
Yeah.
Right,
SSOTBME, I think, was 74.
Right. I, in my head, assumed it came out after Liber Null for some reason. I'm not.
No, definitely before. So he was another of the ancestors of chaos magic, as I saw it. But yes, he was always a very friendly person. I can't remember how I first started communicating with him, but
he wasn't part of that initial group or anything. No, he kind of got to the same place on his, I suppose, by doing his own.
Yeah,
role,
that's right, really. And I knew him more through the Oxford Thelemic Symposium and stuff like that. Meet him there and have a chat with him in the mid-80s. And but then in 1990. I think this must have been 1991 or two. No, it's 90. Yeah, somewhere around there, maybe 92. One of the IoT World meetings, and they always had, in those days, they always had a public-facing part. So there'd be, like, for instance, a 2-day meeting which was open to the public, and there would be like loads of talks and workshops and rituals, and then the public would leave, and there'd be maybe 2 or 3 days of closed meeting for the other people, where we have our own mad scene. And Lionel Snell was invited to speak it was 1991, that's right, because it was the first world meeting I ever went to. He was invited to speak at that, and somebody, I think it was Ian Reid and somebody else, had to go to the airport to pick him up to take this gig in Austria. And so they're driving from some airport in Austria, and they were given strict instructions to initiate him in the car, so he couldn't.
Awesome.
So he was kind of like, given he was made a full member in the car. He'd been around the scene, and he just saw it as a wonderful sort of Discordian joke and everything. But he was actually, he came to other meetings and was really a really good member. But he always did his own thing, But yes,
I think the first time I heard of Dave Lee was the Baptist Head podcast, and I think that's about 2006. Would that be right, or 2005 that you did?
Sounds about right. Yes.
So without jumping, I suppose, too quick straight to that, because that's nearly a decade after what we've been talking about. What was going on? There was a few books between then, probably, was there, or there was more before you got to the Alan Chapman era.
A few more books, a few more influential writers. Yeah, I mean, the layer after Pete Carroll and Ray Sherwin and Ramsey Jukes, Lionel Snell were the first, and then you get the next layer. I suppose you could say would have been Phil Hine,
right?
Who was always, I don't know. I mean, I always struggled with articulating things, and so I was much slower in bringing anything out, even though I was on that scene sooner. I mean, I kind of headhunted Phil Hine in a way for the IoT, and but he then, he started developing communication about the magic much earlier than I did. So his early books were coming out in the early 90s and so forth, or mid 90s maybe. So there was that layer of it, and then Julian Vane coming along, and there was his work. Mm-hmm. Ian Reid was always a massive influence, but he never wrote books. He doesn't really like.
Yeah, that's the thing, because I'm not really familiar with the name even.
No, that's it. You see, it's when the history of this era comes to be written for future generations, then I hope that people will recognise that some of the people who are fairly prominent, because they had a strong social profile, were nothing like as influential as some of the people who appear to be behind the scenes, like
right.
Ingrid took over the British section of the IoT when Pete Carroll left and really built it up. We're still mourning Ingrid. She died just a few months ago.
Oh, right, okay.
But she was an amazing influence on the whole thing, and so was Ian. And so I think he's really the person who is worth mentioning in that regard. There was someone else. There was one other person who wrote very little, although he's rather an interesting character from the early days, Charlie Brewster.
No, I'm not familiar with that name either.
Okay, well, he only ever wrote one book, as far as I'm aware, called Liber Cyber. And it's, I think I can find it here and show you how sort of its era it was just by looking at it. Here it is. It's on my top shelf where all the really obscure chaos magic books are. So it's like A4, stuff with, typescript pages.
Spiral bound.
yeah, that's it. So this is his own sort of tales of magic, and I never met him. He disappeared off the scene. Anyway, the stories are that he did some amazing things with the stock market, but that all came to an end, and he sort of disappeared. But but no, there was the next generation. Would have been Phil Hine, and then kind of like Julian Vane, and I
suppose then at that point the internet was starting to become a thing, so it was probably chaos magic online and those type of things.
That's right. Yeah.
Were you an early adopter of the internet, or did it affect your magic or your writing in any way? Or
well, by 1993, I was section head of the British section of the IoT, and so I needed to talk to people abroad a lot, and I couldn't afford phone calls, so I was delighted when email came along, because email now really was too slow for some of these things. So it was just great. So I adopted email in '93. I had an email.
Oh, really? That early? That's pretty cool.
I had a CompuServe email address, which was something like 10707785 at CompuServe or something.
Right. Awesome.
3 addresses, and then then it got better every few months after that. But I had email in '93, but I didn't really bother. And the first time I ever really searched the internet, I was really impressed by how much you could find out.
Yeah. And all the books, all the badly typed out books that were available at the time.
Yeah. So so that was a time of great change. But yeah, all of that's happening really before the Alan Chapman era, which is really the early noughties, I think. I met Alan through the IoT.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
This was him previous to Baptist Head and all that kind of stuff. Was him just arriving on the scene type of thing, was it?
Yeah, really. I'd never heard of this guy. He is just somebody, a new guy along on the scene, and seemed interesting. And then quite a few years later, he came, I knew him from various meetings and got on okay with him. And then all of a sudden he produced that book. I don't know what year that was, Advanced Magic for Beginners.
Oh, I have to assume it's 2008, is it 2009, something like that?
Yeah. And I think, so I'd have been probably aware of Baptist Head before that, and used to follow it and read about it. And I think the first time that I saw that I really kind of like glommed onto what Alan was doing was when we had a Chaos Magic meeting in London I think it was in 2008, and he did a talk called Magic with a K, how to spell magic with a
right. Very cool.
About the way that Chaos had kind of like swept aside all of that Crowley stuff about higher consciousness and spiritual awakening, and how he was bringing it back. So that was very inspiring. And from that point on, I began to reevaluate my relationship with the idea of awakening.
Yeah, look, because I suppose what I really enjoyed about Alan and Duncan was that whole thing that brought back in a kind of, because it was the question I was asking you earlier, was there an overall, theme or arc to your work? And I find in a lot of kind of, I suppose, in Chaos Magic, that can be missing, that it's just kind of doing sigils to get the stuff, to pay your rent or to, whatever, get your ex-boyfriend back, whatever is the story. Whereas with the Alan and Duncan stuff, there was just kind of, oh no, there's a reason for all this. We're doing, there's a kind of in that kind of weird low magic, high magic divide, that kind of things. I find that very interesting. So do you recognize that as well? Is it something that you wanted to pursue, I suppose, the kind of enlightenment part of magic?
Yes, indeed. Yes, I did. And there was, before that, actually, there was another phase in, I know what you mean about, after a while, Chaos Magic, if approached in the sort of, the fundamentalist Carolian sort of fashion, is a bit limiting after a while. It's it's just you can do sigils for this, that, and the other, but it's after a while. In fact, you mostly end up doing, if you're doing practical magic, I think you mostly end up doing it for other people, don't you? Because your own life does actually start to click into place, and things do get better as your magic improves. So in the end, you only really do spells. So when for maybe things you believe in changing in the world, or for someone who needs a bit of help.
Yeah, or someone gets sick or something like that.
Yeah, that sort of thing. So that's tended to be most of my magic for a long, long time. But at some point, in the 90s, I recognized this process and thought, I want to study some tradition really deeply. And I'd been interested in various traditions. I've been interested in the I Ching, for instance, and Taoism. I've been interested a bit in Tantra and in Voodoo, but I thought I need to study a tradition that's close to home, because it's such a rabbit hole. Once you go into a tradition, it is such a rabbit hole. There's so many different things. So I decided to study the Northern tradition, the Germanic esotericism, and I joined the Roon Guild in '96, January '96. And started my work on the 9 Doors of Midgard, the initiatic program of the Roon Guild. So I was already stepping out of the kind of fundamentalist chaos frame, if you like.
Yeah.
By the time I collided with Alan's mystical discourse. But yes, I recognized in what Alan was doing something that I really longed for. I thought, okay, this is finally beginning to join up all the different strands that I'd had since my teenage acid trips, and the getting into sorcery, sort of chaos sorcery sort of stuff, and then getting into the traditional stuff. And where does it all join together? Where does it all link up? Where's the invisible point at the center of that mandala? And it was Alan showing that not only is awakening a real thing, but it can be achieved, and it's worth achieving, all of those things. Because I went to, for instance, of how I was still put off by most people's discourse about awakening. I went on a Vipassana retreat in 2005. Okay. So in Hereford, you probably heard of the centre there. You go along, you pay a voluntary contribution. you have 10 or 11 days of complete silence and no socializing and no boozing or smoking or anything like that. And,
No fun. No fun whatsoever.
no
Yeah.
fun is allowed, yeah. And you just sit for, kind of 6 hours a day, basically doing meditation. And there's about an hour or more a day of Mr. Goenka, the founder of that institution.
These the videos that get
On
brought in.
DVD from
Yeah.
Mr. Goenka, and they do sort of sell Vipassana as a completely what's the word I'm looking for, non-denominational approach to meditation.
Okay.
Do this, and I think that's an amazing organization. I mean, in India, they've got like tens of thousands of people meditating in prison.
All right, cool. Yeah.
Imagine if you're just some person who's been nicked for something, you've probably had a horrible life, you're bummed in prison, and somebody teaches you to meditate. That'd be an amazing thing. That's such a cool. So I really like a lot of what they're doing, and I respected them from the start, but they're not really non-denominational. I mean, in Goenka's talks, you realize that he's talking a model which is entirely about reincarnation. And it's a really like, if you meditate for 2 hours a day for the next, I don't know what he said, but let's say 10,000 lifetimes, it's something like that,
Right, okay.
You might achieve, a full awakening. Right. And so I just came home and thought, no.
No.
I read more of their literature and and practiced for a while, but I fell away from it quite quickly. I thought, what's the point? There's some exotic state of consciousness that you might be able to achieve in some future incarnation. What's that about? Who cares?
Yeah. In thousands and thousands of years, maybe.
Yeah, so I was still pretty cynical about the whole thing, even at that stage. And then, but Alan, Alan and Duncan interviewed me for the Baptist Head, and I got into a really long dialogue with them from then onwards. I think that was about 07. And and I thought, no, this stuff is for me. This definitely is for me. Here's someone, as I watched Alan progressing, I realized I'm seeing someone in the process of awakening, basically.
Yeah.
And, they've got his own way of doing it. He cobbled together various systems, and eventually him and Duncan had both got a result out of it. And it was a result such as can only be described as a spiritual awakening. And here's, they're talking about how they did it, and here you can do it too.
Yeah.
So it's not something that's in the remote, distant future. It's not something that's almost impossible, and it's not something that's almost pointless. It's the opposite of all those things.
Yeah. So it's very kind of practical, very pragmatic. This is it, and very honest too. The ups and downs and all of those things, which is quite refreshing, because the whole kind of awakening enlightenment thing is usually presented as 10,000 lifetimes, it's for the select few, that kind of stuff. And my thing, which I got from Alan and Duncan, was that, well, if it is possible and people are doing it, then it could be possible for me too, that it's that kind of if one person can do it, then surely anyone can do it. Which was what got me into chaos magic in the first place, in that it's not just for the elite, it's not just for the the secret societies, it's we can all do this.
Well, I think it's obviously what Alan's doing has come a long way from Pete Carroll's chaos magic, but I still think that chaos magic was an important influence on what Alan's doing.
I would say so too.
Like you're saying, it's that sort of honest and skeptical approach to the whole process. This kind of open-ended approach is very chaos-like. And I mean, I'd done my own hypersigil. When I wrote that book, Chaotopia, this was to some extent a hypersigil to bring the same discourse, the same critical discourse that had so well informed practical magic in the chaos magic era into mysticism, so that we could have a sort of chaos mysticism equivalent. And I regard it as a success because people started writing about, Julian Vane wrote a bit about his relationship with his HGA in the next book he brought out. And then, a few years later, Alan started writing and publishing. So
you're to blame for all of this, then, is what you're saying?
Yeah, it's all my fault.
So where are what is where do you, well, I know, but what's your current kind of practice? What are you doing? Where is your head at these days?
Well, I mean, my practice at the moment consists of half an hour's meditation a day along the lines that Alan prescribes. He talks about 3 different meditations, beloved, fire, and underworld. And so I tend to, alternate between those on a spontaneous kind of basis. But I try to make sure I get a meditation in every day. I very seldom miss it. When I first started daily meditation, I think that was 2011. And I sort of took a vow, April of that year, that I was going to like really go for it and do it every day instead of just, mucking about with it. And it took me 6 months to get a real taste for it. It's kind of like, oh, I've got to do it. So first,
the chore.
I really started to miss it if I didn't have a session.
All right, great.
I've always found that if I've got some daily magical work to do, that it really improves my mood. I am subject, like a lot of people, to low mood from time to time, and having daily magical work to do just massively improves that situation. Just the fact that I've got somewhere I can go each day where I just, whatever mood I'm in, I'm falling into the center of everything.
Yeah.
That where all the action is, in a sense, or all the inaction is. And
so it's having a sense of sacredness in your life, that is quite important, which is missing an awful lot from contemporary life, I suppose.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no point at the center of the mandala of modern or postmodern culture. It's just a sort of marsh of a sort of mess, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have to, you've only got your own resources. You have to keep coming back and, going to that point, that vanishing point at the center of it all, so that you can recognize that not only are you in time, but you're in eternity. And, not only is there all the confusion of communication, but there's also silence and all of those things.
Yeah, it's much needed. So you have a new teaching course out, or two, as far as I know. It's two separate courses. Can you tell us all a bit about that?
Yeah, well, it's only 6 days ago now. I opened my Chaotopia School of Magic on the Teachable platform.
Right.
And you might not have heard of Teachable. It doesn't matter in itself. It's a platform where you can create a school. And I've got about 10 courses planned. I've already launched 2 of them. And I've got a third ready to go. The first 2 I've launched are, there's Exploring Breathwork, which couple of years, about 3 years ago, might be 2 or 3 years ago, I brought out a book called Life Force.
Great book, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Sensed energy in breathwork, chaos magic, and psychedelia. And it's the first part 1, that's in 5 parts. Part 1 of that is about the techniques of different styles of breathwork. And so this course, kind of like, in a way, it's like a practical, a practice-based course based on that first part 1 of Life Force. Okay. So that's the ideal companion for it. And it's a big course, 17 videos and various downloadable PDFs and various exercises to do, sort of thing that you could easily take 6 months over. Right. And a lot about 8 different styles of breath work. And the other course I put up there, I wanted to put one paying course up there. That's one's got a price on it, but I wanted to put a free course up as well, because to obviously it brings attention to the school.
Yeah.
And get free stuff, but also because it involves stuff. The course is entirely made up of stuff that I didn't invent, so I can't charge money for anyway. But it's just presentations of various methods called magical self-care. And it's kind of an overview of different. I've described it as the tips of many icebergs of magical technique that help towards maintaining health and about healing. So there's a bit about pranayama in there. There's a bit about using connected breath work in to interrupt negative states. There's a bit about visualization and aura work. And then it ends on the use of a magical healing spirit, which was created originally by the IoT, but has been released to the world about 20 years ago. So that's a very powerful kind of spirit entity. So that's the free course. And I think about 40 people have already signed up for that.
Great. And would you advise people to start with the free course? Is that a good primer for the other course, or can you jump straight into the main course if you want?
To either. It's what you want, really. But I mean, having a free course which is about magical self-care, I think is very apt at the moment, because people's what with the public health situation, and what's more, people's fears about the public health situation and the negative states people get themselves into because of lockdown and all that sort of stuff. I think it's probably the reason, some of the reasons why that's been so so successful. But no, it doesn't really relate to the other course. There's a
Right.
tiny overlap in the breathwork. The third one I'm going to be releasing, I've got to make some extra videos for it. It's one that I've done live and both in person and online. It's called Introduction to Rune Magic.
Oh, right. Okay.
That's going to be a slightly shorter course, probably about 10 videos. And that is kind of basic runic sorcery. You know, it's how to use the runes to do basic magic. But it also incorporates rune song, because one of my favorite methods of getting into a magical high is singing.
Okay.
You know, that there's something about that on there. And there's also going to be a masterclass on rune singing as well, a separate thing.
Great stuff. And when people join up Teachable, it's is it just that you get a load of videos, or is there interaction with you? Can they send you questions? What way does that all work?
All of these courses are no interaction. They're just lifetime access of videos and PDFs, right. And some audio files. Yeah, so they're lifetime access. You can take as long as you want, but you don't get any personal interaction with me unless you actually come into the... I offer personal coaching with each of these as well. So people can book an hour on Zoom with me for individual coaching on particular things. And I think that's probably the way to do it. So they're just something to create and leave there for people, really.
Right. And is it it's can they download it, can use it the phone, all of that kind of stuff, I assume?
Sorry, you can use...
Like you can get it in, the phone, to get it in their, the desktop. It's access through any kind of...
Yeah, you can access it through the phone or the computer. Yeah.
Great stuff. So anything else or anything we missed out on, or anything else you want to talk about or mention before we go?
Well, I think that's most of it. I mean, that's my main kind of like, that's my big new outward facing thing. I suppose the main other public facing thing I do, which I suppose you could put in your notes or something, is that site, is my newsletter. So, people sign up to that. You get the news of all the courses that are coming out that I'm doing, and also some of my kind of like current obsessions and links to all sorts of weird stuff in the world.
It's very, very interesting. I always look forward to getting them. Yeah, so I'll put all of the stuff in the show notes, which is the teachable stuff, the mailing list stuff. Is there the website? The website still going at this point?
Website as well. Yeah, that's kind of like a bit of a building site at the moment. Because I'm changing the front page into something which will link more directly to School of Chaotopia, but I'm having a bit of difficulty with some of the link technology there, and I've got a help ticket with Teachable on about that at the moment, so that'll take a few days. But the website's still usable. It just looks a bit scruffy when you first go in,
Which is fine. But we can get over that. Well, thank you very much, Dave. I really, really enjoyed that chat. It was very, very insightful and informative, and I always enjoy talking to you. And hopefully, at some stage in the future, we'll get to do this again. So, thank you very much.
Great stuff. Cheers, Tommy. It's been fun.